The mud of Silver Creek was not merely dirt and water. It was a hungry, living thing that sought to swallow a person whole, much like the town itself. Lynn felt the cold, brown slurry seep through the worn seams of her leather boots, biting at her ankles with the chill of early spring, but she did not slow her pace. The basket of laundry balanced on her hip was heavy, laden with the stiff, starch-collared shirts of the men who looked through her as if she were made of glass. To them, she was a ghost haunting the periphery of their civilization, a remnant of the railroad days that they wished had vanished along with the steel tracks. She kept her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the treacherous path, refusing to meet the gazes that she knew were filled with either dismissal or open hostility. The spring thaw had come early to the valley, turning the frozen earth into a quagmire, and the air smelled of wet pine, horse manure, and the sharp tang of wood smoke. Lynn's muscles burned with a familiar dull ache, a testament to the endless hours she spent scrubbing the filth from other people's lives, her hands constantly raw and red from the lye soap. She walked until she reached the livery stables, the domain of Mayor Miller, a man whose corpulence was a sign of greed in a land where most men were lean as whips. Miller stood by the trough, wiping his hands on a rag that was cleaner than anything Lynn owned. When she approached, setting the basket down on a dry patch of wooden decking with a soft thud, he didn't even turn to look at her immediately. He let her wait, let the silence stretch until it became an insult in itself. Lynn clasped her hands before her, her fingers interlocking tightly to hide their trembling, not from fear, but from a simmering, pressurized rage she had learned to bottle deep within her chest. Finally, Miller turned, kicking the basket with the toe of his boot. He grunted, tossing a small pouch of coins toward her. It landed in the mud, inches from the decking. It was a calculated cruelty, a demand for her to bow. Lynn stared at the pouch. It was light, too light. She knew without counting that it was half of what was promised, half of what she needed to buy flour and seed for the planting season. "It is short, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice soft but steady, the accent of her homeland clipping the edges of the rough western tongue. Miller laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Tax for the privilege of breathing my air, China doll," he sneered. "Take it and go, or I'll have the boys run you off for vagrancy." Lynn paused, the wind whipping a loose strand of black hair across her face. She slowly bent her knees, ignoring the pop of her joints, and plucked the pouch from the mire. She wiped it on her apron, her face a mask of stone, and turned away. She had endured worse. She would endure this. The journey back to her cabin was a pilgrimage of isolation, measuring the distance between her soul and the cruelty of men. Her home was not near the town. It was miles away, nestled in the foothills where the timberline met the rocky crags of the mountains, a place the townspeople deemed too wild and difficult to settle. This was her sanctuary. As the sounds of the saloon and the blacksmith's hammer faded into the distance, replaced by the rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker and the rush of the swelling river, Lynn's shoulders finally relaxed. The landscape here was waking up. Violent bursts of purple and yellow wildflowers pushed through the patchy remnants of grass, and the trees, shaking off their winter slumber, dripped with melting dew that caught the afternoon light like diamonds. It was beautiful, but it was an indifferent beauty. The wilderness did not care if she starved or thrived. It simply existed, honest and brutal, unlike the lies of the town. She walked with the methodical gait of someone who knows that rushing only invites exhaustion. Her mind drifted to her late husband, a man who had died building the country that now rejected his widow. They had built the cabin together, dragging the logs with their own backs, chinking the gaps with river clay and straw. Every inch of that structure held a memory of his sweat and his laughter. Now, the silence of the cabin was her only companion. She often spoke to the empty air, telling him about the laundry, the price of grain, the way the hawks circled the canyon. Today, however, She had no words for the dead. The humiliation at the livery stable burned in her gut like a swallowed coal. She focused on the physical sensation of the walk, the strap of the empty basket rubbing her shoulder, the sucking sound of the mud, the coolness of the breeze drying the sweat on her neck. She had to survive. That was her revenge. To exist was to defy them. As the sun began to dip toward the jagged horizon, painting the sky in bruises of violet and blood orange, she crested the final ridge that overlooked her clearing. The smoke from her chimney should have been a welcoming ribbon against the sky, but as she looked down, her heart hammered a warning rhythm against her ribs. The birds had gone silent. The squirrels were not chattering. The woods were holding their breath, waiting for violence. Lynn stopped dead, her instincts screaming. She dropped the basket, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she kept tied at her waist, though she knew the blade was dull and short. A sound tore through the unnatural quiet, a low, vibrating growl that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, followed by the sickening, wet snap of jaws. She crept forward, using the trunk of a massive ponderosa pine as a shield, peering into her clearing. The scene before her was a tableau of primal chaos. Near the woodpile, a pack of wolves, lean and ragged from the lean winter months, circled a figure backed against the rough-hewn logs of her home. It was a man. He was not one of the townsfolk. His long, dark hair hung loose and matted with sweat, and he wore the buckskins of the Apache, though they were shredded and dark with blood. He held a broken knife in one hand, his other arm hanging uselessly at his side, dripping crimson onto the thawing earth. There were 5 wolves. 2 lay twitching on the ground, silenced by his blade, but the remaining 3 were emboldened by the scent of his weakening pulse. The man, the warrior, was failing. Lynn could see the tremor in his legs. He was huge, a towering wall of muscle and bronze skin, but even mountains could be eroded by the storm. He swiped his knife at the alpha, a massive gray beast with yellow eyes that burned with hunger, but the blow was slow, sluggish. The wolf snapped, catching the warrior's forearm, and the man let out a guttural roar of pain, falling to one knee. He was going to die. Here, on her doorstep, this stranger, a man her neighbors called a savage, a monster, was going to be torn apart. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Lynn's chest. If she stayed hidden, the wolves would eat their fill and leave. She would be safe. But then she looked at the man's face. Even as death closed its jaws around him, his eyes were wide and blazing with a defiant, furious will to live. He did not look like a monster. He looked like she felt every day in the town, cornered, outnumbered, and fighting a war everyone wanted him to lose. The connection was instantaneous and terrifying. She could not watch another soul be crushed by the world. Lynn moved before her mind could catch up with her body. She sprinted from the tree line, not toward the safety of the woods, but toward the fire pit where she boiled the laundry water. The embers were still hot, buried under gray ash. She grabbed the heavy iron shovel leaning against the stones, her hands gripping the rough wood so hard splinters bit into her palms. "Get back!" she screamed, her voice cracking, high and shrill, shattering the predatory trance of the pack. She scooped up a mass of burning coals and ash and flung it with all her strength at the alpha wolf. The beast yelped as the embers seared its sensitive nose and fur, scrambling backward in a cloud of gray dust and sparks. Lynn didn't stop. She wielded the shovel like a spear, swinging it wildly, screaming nonsensical sounds, channeling every ounce of rage she had swallowed in front of Miller. "Go! Go!" she shrieked. The wolves, confused by this new, loud, fire-throwing demon, hesitated. In the wild, injury meant death. The alpha snarled, snapping at the air, but the fire had spooked him. With a final, resentful bark, he turned and loped into the shadows, the others following close behind. Silence crashed back into the clearing, heavier than before. Lynn stood heaving, her chest rising and falling in ragged gasps, the shovel trembling in her hands. She turned to the man. He was slumped against the logs, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow and wet. He looked at her, and for a moment she thought he might strike her, thinking she was another enemy. But his hand went limp, the broken knife slipping from his fingers. He tried to speak, a rasp of a language she did not know, and then his eyes rolled back. He collapsed sideways into the mud. Lynn dropped the shovel and rushed to him. Up close, he was terrifyingly large, his presence dominating the space even in unconsciousness. She grabbed him by the shoulders, trying to pull him toward the door, but he was dead weight, solid muscle and bone. "Wake up," she hissed, panic rising. "I cannot carry you." He did not stir. Gritting her teeth, she grabbed him under the arms, digging her heels into the slick ground. She pulled. She strained until white spots danced in her vision. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him over the threshold, his boots scraping deep furrows in the earth. She kicked the door shut behind them and threw the heavy wooden bolt, locking out the night, the wolves, and the world. The interior of the cabin was dim, lit only by the dying light filtering through the oil paper windows. Lynn hurried to the table, her hands shaking as she struck a match to light the kerosene lamp. The golden glow flared to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. She turned to look at the stranger lying on her braided rug. The light revealed the extent of the damage. His buckskin tunic was torn to ribbons, revealing a map of old scars crisscrossed by fresh, weeping wounds. The worst was a deep gash on his thigh and the bite on his forearm. The metallic scent of blood filled the small room, overpowering the smell of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Lynn fell into the rhythm of work. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She went to the stove, stoked the fire, and set a kettle of water to boil. She tore strips from her cleanest white linens, fabric she had been saving for a dress she would never make, and gathered her jars of salve, made from bear grease and crushed arnica. She knelt beside him, cutting away the ruined leather of his clothes with her shears. Her hands, usually rough from labor, moved with surprising gentleness. As she pressed a warm, wet cloth to the wound on his chest, cleaning away the mud and gore, the warrior suddenly gasped. His eyes flew open, black and bottomless, filled with the disorientation of a cornered animal. His hand shot out, clamping around her wrist with the force of a bear trap. Lynn froze. She did not pull away. She knew that to struggle was to invite attack. She met his gaze, her own eyes wide but steady. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, a fever burning beneath the surface. He stared at her, his breathing ragged, processing the ceiling, the smell of sage, the woman with the porcelain face and the terrified eyes. He looked at the cloth in her hand, then back to her face. Slowly, the tension left his arm. He did not speak, but he released her wrist, his hand falling back to the floor with a heavy thud. It was a truce, a silent permission. Lynn exhaled a breath she didn't know she was holding and dipped the cloth back into the water. She worked through the night, a silent guardian tending to the broken warrior, while outside the wind began to howl, mourning the blood spilled on the earth. For 3 days the cabin existed in a suspended reality, a small island of warmth amidst the vast, indifferent wilderness. Lynn moved through the hours with the quiet efficiency of a woman who knew that idleness invited despair. She slept in the wooden rocking chair, a quilt pulled up to her chin, her hand resting near the handle of the knife on the table. The warrior, whose name she learned was Taklashim, during a fevered murmur in the depths of the second night, drifted between the haze of infection and the sharp clarity of pain. When the fever finally broke on the morning of the 4th day, the change was immediate. Lynn was outside, her breath misting in the crisp morning air as she chopped kindling, the rhythmic thwack of the axe echoing off the canyon walls. Her arms ached, the muscles protesting the strain, but the woodpile had to be replenished. She did not hear him approach. One moment she was alone. The next, a shadow fell across the chopping block. She spun around, the axe held defensively across her chest. Taklashim stood in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame. He was pale, The bronze of his skin washed out to a sickly gray, but his eyes were clear, obsidian hard, and focused entirely on her. He watched her hands, red and chapped from the cold, and then his gaze moved to the axe. He did not smile. He did not offer a flowery gratitude. He simply nodded, a sharp, singular motion of his chin. "You work," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "Like a man." It was not an insult. In his tone, it was the highest honor. Lynn lowered the axe, her heart hammering against her ribs, not from fear, but from the intensity of being truly seen for the first time in years. Later that afternoon, the quiet truce was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Not the unshod ponies of the mountain tribes, but the heavy, clomping gait of draft horses and the jingle of commercial tack. Lynn was inside, mending the tear in Taklisham's buckskins, while he sat by the fire, sharpening her dull kitchen knife with a whetstone he had produced from his pouch. The sound of men's voices, loud and boisterous, drifted through the timber walls. Lynn froze, her needle hovering mid-stitch. She knew those voices. It was Miller's foreman, a man named Vance, who enjoyed the cruelty of his job far too much, accompanied by two of the stable hands. They had come for the tax she supposedly still owed, or perhaps just a reminder of her place. Panic, cold and familiar, washed over her. She looked at Taklisham. He had stopped sharpening the knife. His head was cocked, listening, his body tense as a coiled spring despite his injuries. "Stay," Lynn whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, if they see you, they will kill you. They will burn this house." Taklisham looked at her, his expression unreadable, but he did not move to hide. He simply set the knife down on the table, his hand resting near it. Lynn smoothed her apron, took a deep breath to steady her shaking hands, and stepped out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind her. Vance sat atop a large bay gelding, looking down at her with a sneer that twisted his scarred lip. The other two men flanked him, their hands resting casually near the pistols on their hips. The horses stamped in the mud, churning up the pristine earth Lynn had swept just that morning. "Well now, look at this," Vance drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that landed inches from Lynn's boot. "The China doll is hiding away in her palace." The men laughed, a harsh, grating sound that grated against the serenity of the mountains. "Mayor Miller says you were short on your payment, Lynn. Says you disrespected him." Lynn kept her head high, though her knees felt like water. "I paid what I had," she said, her voice finding a steel core she didn't know it possessed. "I paid exactly half, as agreed for the winter months. The rest is due at harvest." Vance swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground, the thud heavy and menacing. He walked up the steps, towering over her, smelling of stale whiskey and unwashed sweat. "The terms have changed," he hissed, stepping into her personal space, forcing her to press her back against the rough wood of the door. "The mayor wants the land. He thinks this creek would make a fine spot for a mill. You have until sundown to pack your rags and get." He reached out, his dirty fingers grabbing her chin, squeezing hard enough to bruise. "Or maybe," he leered, "we take payment in trade right now." The door behind Lynn did not open. It exploded outward. The wood splintered with a deafening crack as it slammed against the interior wall. Vance stumbled back, releasing Lynn, his hand going for his gun, but he was too slow. Taklisham moved not like a wounded man, but like an avalanche. He filled the doorway, a terrifying silhouette of vengeance. He did not have a gun. He held only the kitchen knife he had been sharpening, and a heavy iron poker from the fireplace in his other hand. The sight of him, an Apache warrior, scarred and bandaged, eyes burning with a demon's fury, froze the men in their boots. In the west, the Apache were the monsters of their nightmares, the ghosts that haunted the dark, and to find one here, in the home of the washerwoman, was a shock that short-circuited their bravado. Tocklesham let out a roar, a sound that wasn't human, and lunged. He didn't go for Vance. He went for the support beam of the porch railing, swinging the iron poker with such violence that the wood shattered, sending a spray of splinters into the faces of the men. It was a display of raw, unbridled power. "Go!" he bellowed, the English word clumsy but undeniable. Vance scrambled backward, tripping over his own spurs, falling into the mud. The horses reared, terrified by the noise and the scent of predator. "Devil!" one of the stable hands screamed, wheeling his horse around. "She's conjuring devils!" Vance scrambled to his feet, his face drained of all color, the lecherous smirk replaced by the stark terror of a prey animal. He didn't even try to mount his horse. He grabbed the reins and sprinted, dragging the animal down the trail, his men following in a chaotic retreat of flailing limbs and terrified curses. They did not look back. Silence reclaimed the clearing, but it was a different kind of silence now, charged, electric. Lynn stood pressed against the wall, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at Tocklesham. He stood at the edge of the porch, watching the dust settle, his chest heaving. The exertion had torn his stitches. A fresh bloom of red was spreading across the white bandage on his thigh. He turned to her, and the terrifying rage vanished from his eyes, replaced by a deep, weary concern. He dropped the poker and the knife, the metal clattering on the deck. He reached out, his large, rough hand hovering for a moment before gently touching the red mark on her chin where Vance had grabbed her. His thumb brushed the skin, a touch feather light, completely at odds with the violence he had just displayed. "Safe," he said, the word heavy with promise. "You, safe." Lynn's knees finally gave out, and she sank to the floor, weeping not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of finally having a protector. Tocklesham sat beside her, a silent sentinel, watching the tree line until the sun went down. The night passed in a vigil. Neither of them slept. Tocklesham sat by the window, weapon in hand, while Lynn packed a small bag, fearing the men would return with reinforcements. But the dawn brought a different kind of thunder. It started as a low vibration in the floorboards, growing steadily until the very air seemed to tremble. Lynn grabbed her bag, eyes wide with terror. "They brought the whole town," she whispered, extinguishing the lamp. Tocklesham shook his head. He stood up, wincing as he put weight on his leg, and opened the door. The morning light flooded the cabin, blindingly bright. Lynn shielded her eyes, stepping out behind him, expecting to see a lynch mob. Instead, she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The cabin was surrounded, but not by townsfolk. Dozens of horses stood in the clearing, their coats gleaming in the sun. Paints, Appaloosas, Mustangs. Astride them were the Apache. They sat silent and regal, their faces painted for war or ceremony, feathers fluttering in the breeze. There were women, too, weaving through the riders, carrying bundles. The circle parted, and an older man with silver hair and a chest-plate of bone rode forward. He looked at Tocklesham, then at Lynn. He spoke in their tongue, a rapid, flowing stream of sounds that sounded like wind moving through dry grass. Tocklesham answered, gesturing to his leg, then to Lynn, then to the shovel leaning against the wall. The older man nodded slowly. He raised his hand, and the riders dismounted as one. They did not attack. They approached the porch with a reverence that stunned Lynn into immobility. They began to lay items at the foot of the stairs. It was a flood of wealth in a land where survival was the only currency. There were piles of cured buffalo hides, thick and warm, sacks of dried venison and pemmican, intricate baskets woven from willow and yucca, and jewelry made of silver and heavy turquoise stones that mirrored the sky. One woman stepped forward and placed a beautiful spotted mare's reins over the porch railing. She looked at Lynn, her eyes dark and searching, and placed a hand over her heart, then extended it palm up toward Lynn. It was a universal sign. Gratitude, debt, family. Tacklesham turned to Lynn. The moment hung suspended in time, fragile and beautiful. He did not belong in her world of laundry and mud, and she could not survive in his world of constant movement and war. They both knew this. The tragedy of their lives was that they were two broken pieces that fit together perfectly, but belonged to different puzzles. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small object, a rough, unpolished stone of black obsidian wrapped in leather cord. He took her hand, his calloused palm swallowing hers, and pressed the stone into her fingers. "You fight," he said, his voice low and intense. "You, warrior." He looked deep into her eyes, communicating a lifetime of respect in 2 seconds. Then he stepped off the porch. He did not look back. He mounted the horse brought for him, and with a single cry from the elder, the tribe turned and vanished into the tree line as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Lynn standing on her porch, surrounded by a fortune in gifts, the spotted mare nuzzling her shoulder, and a heart that was breaking and healing all at once. The town of Silver Creek did not bother Lynn again. When the men saw the Apache mare in her paddock and the turquoise around her neck, a new legend grew, that the washerwoman was a witch under the protection of the mountain spirits. They crossed the street when she passed, not out of disdain, but out of fear and respect. Lynn never corrected them. She used the furs to survive the winter in comfort, and she rode the mare to the high ridges every spring, looking out over the valley. She remained alone, but she was never lonely again. She had learned that worth is not determined by the coins in a man's purse or the color of one's skin, but by the fire in one's spirit. Have you ever felt like the world was waiting for you to fail? Have you ever stood alone against a giant armed only with your courage? Lynn's story reminds us that even the smallest stone can turn the course of a mighty river. True strength isn't about how loud you shout, but how firmly you stand when the wolves come. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that kindness is the ultimate bravery, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of resilience. Share this with someone who is fighting their own silent battle today. You never know who needs to be reminded that they are a warrior.